UNO has always been an expanding university, constantly moving forward. But as we move forward, we must also look back to where we began. Let's go back in time with the people who remember UNO the way it was. Join us for Reflections in Time.
It's a lovely spring day in the spring, the late spring, May actually, of 1989. And as we often are when we do these kinds of programs, we're situated in the beautiful new Health, Physical Education, Recreation building here on our UNO campus. It's a place, a quiet place, very appropriately, where one can do some reflective thinking. And that's what I've asked a lot of people to do over the past many years, to do some reflections on their time here at UNO. And that's, I guess, why we've caused the program, or the series of tapes that we've been making over the years, to be called Reflections in Time, where a person sits down and chats with me about their time here at the university. We choose people who have been here often a long, long time, or have retired, whatever reason, have formed a part of the history of this place that I think is important. And today's no exception. We have my colleague from our communication department, Dr. Elton Carter. He's been with us for quite a while, but he's been other places on campus too. Elton, glad you could come by and sit and chat a bit about old times and current times too.
Thank you, Paul. It's a privilege to be part of this series.
Thank you. Now, I don't know that I've ever asked you, so I'm going to do it now, and I like to have it as a part of these tapes, Elton. Where in the world did you hail from? Where were you as a little boy? And tell us a little about your background, your family, that sort of thing.
I was born and grew up as a farm kid in northern Maine.
Oh, did you?
My father was a farmer, and in Aroostook County, the main agricultural crop is primarily potatoes, although they had some farm animals and grains and so on. I went to a one-room country school, by the way.
Hey, I can relate. I did it too.
All the grades. And then a high school that had about 18 graduating students, about a mile down the road. We used to walk to school somewhere.
You could walk to school all the time, huh?
That's right. And after I finished high school, I should have decided before, but after I finished high school, I decided I wanted to go on to college.
Can you have any memory of why you wanted to go on to college? Did other people in your family go to college, or was it just you? Or?
Well, I had an older half-brother who had gone to college, but I think, frankly, Paul, it was largely a matter of wanting to get out of some of the farm work.
I can relate to that, too.
I remember I deliberately planned summer sessions while I was at the University of Maine, so I wouldn't have to engage in haying season.
Oh, you missed haying season.
And I majored eventually. I started out with the idea I might be a lawyer. And then I was attracted by the activities in the speech department. Remember, Dr. Howard Runyon was the head of the department then, from done his work at Michigan. And I had some speech pathology and speech correction and a little experience just to dabble there. It really wasn't much of a program. But we did have a debate team, and I was a member of that, and got to make a number of trips I wouldn't have made otherwise, including to Washington, and met with our senators, and in New York, where we saw some plays, and Broadway, and so on.
You were attending the University of Maine?
Yes. And I graduated the class of 1940. I was out one semester because I had an accident and infection in my hand. But I graduated in mid-year 1941, and a former University of Maine associate, I think he married a girl who graduated from the University of Maine, Delight Morris.
What an interesting name.
Was, yes, and well known in some circles, as I'll mention in a minute. He was at Indiana State Teachers College, it was called then, in Terre Haute. And so I was employed as his assistant when I graduated, and I went to Indiana State.
Did you have ideas now of more graduate work, or,
yeah, that was
or teaching?
That was a
whatever?
master's program. I wasn't settled on teaching
No,
yet, but
no.
it was a job at that time.
Sure,
actually.
sure.
And I served, it was a semester or a year, and then that assistantship ran out, actually, but the state of Indiana passed a bill requiring the testing of hearing, audiometric testing in the public schools.
Ah.
So I was named a traveling hearing consultant. I bought a $75 old Essex, and I drove all over the state of Indiana doing hearing testing. One little incident about that might interest you. And I would go into the schools with these tests, you see, where they played a record that got lower and lower sound.
Yes.
The kids wrote numbers in the form. And it had to be done under very quiet conditions. So I would move into the schools, you see, and I'd work with a principal or whoever. And then I usually got great cooperation, and I'd always issue orders, something like a military office. And the students would serve as assistants to round up students and score these forms and so on. And in this one school, after I'd acted this way for until recess, then this young lady came up to me and said, "How old are you?" And I told her. She didn't say anything else, so I said, "Well, why did you ask?" She said, "I was just wondering how long it took to get that way."
That could be taken in a variety of ways, couldn't it?
Well, yes. And we encountered students with difficulties with reverse writing and this sort of thing, and occasionally teachers who didn't understand and accused the students of being stupid and so on.
Were you using an audiometer of sorts?
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
A group audiometer, and then
Mm-hmm.
we could do follow-up hearing tone tests. Along about this time, Paul, the draft was available
Yes.
for military service, World War II. And Dr. Morris offered to suggest that I was an essential person for the war effort, and my conscience wouldn't take that. So I waited to be drafted instead of volunteering, served in the 8th Air Force, which we got training around different parts of the United States.
Oh, yeah.
After basic training, we had training in Morse code, which I never used, and in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where they treated us as if we were royalty, marvelous people. And then we were shipped to Boca Raton, Florida, where we had a course in radar mechanics, basic electronics, and then radar
Getting a lot of training here.
mechanics. So I was called a radar mechanic. I served under that label. I didn't claim I was particularly competent as a radar mechanic, but we serviced the carpet equipment, it was called, highly classified at the time, which served to jam the gun-laying radars in the war.
Oh.
And it had glass tubes, and if the tube was dark, we changed it and things like that. But when, after being delayed and all the other things that are typical of military service,
Yes.
when they're shopping things around and shifting logistics and so on, we were shipped overseas to England at a time when about 50% of the crews were being lost, crews and airplanes.
Yeah, there was a tough period in there, wasn't
Tough, yes, very tough. That is, on those crews, we were ground services.
it? Yeah.
And we had, when we first got the jamming equipment, we didn't have enough to serve all of the airplanes on a given mission, so we'd wait to find out which planes would fly. And although it wasn't dangerous particularly, but it was, let's say, interesting to go out and change the sets from one airplane to another in the middle of the night when it's so foggy. It's England now we're talking about.
Yeah.
We don't have fogs like that around here.
No, no.
And very cold in the winter. But we would usually scramble around and get whatever equipment we had in the planes that were going to fly. Although a few of the people we knew lived in the same Nissen huts or whatever were lost in the war, I think the saddest scene of all was going on an airplane to check some equipment just before takeoff, after the crews had been briefed. And they knew they were going on a tough mission. It was like walking in a morgue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, there were people that were memorable for their integrity and their respect. I remember, for example, we were asked to donate to the war effort by buying bonds, war bonds. And I don't think I was unusual in being rather negative about it. We'd been reading in Stars and Stripes newspaper about strikes back here in the States. I know my attitude was rather negative. But we lined up to go through payroll line, and the major in charge of our unit made the shortest and most persuasive speech I ever heard. He said, "Men, they're asking us to buy war bonds, and they wouldn't ask us if they didn't need them." I don't think anybody on that line failed to sign up. It was on that man's integrity, respect we had for him.
Personal proof.
Yes, personal proof, exactly.
Did you enjoy the service, Elton?
Maybe
that's wrong.
I enjoyed several minutes of the service. The rest of the time, I hated it. After Germany was defeated, there was a delay, and one of the enjoyable moments you remind me of is when one of the officers who eventually, by the way, joined the faculty at Lincoln, he's a playwright. But he was a lieutenant in the outfit, and he came in our barracks one night and said, "Hey, you guys want to go to Paris?" Well, sure, we want to go to Paris.
Of course.
Who wouldn't want to go to Paris? He asked a couple of us. We said, well, okay. They're going to have a literacy training program over there. He said, if it goes through, I'll set it up. So a couple of us flew to Paris, had a few days to scout around, and with garbled French, trying to find the Notre Dame Cathedral and a few things like this. And then this short literacy training program. That never did develop, but it gave us a trip to Paris.
Yeah, it gave you a lovely trip.
During leave, I went to London. There were air raids, I remember, and I was the only one that seemed to mind them much. The natives were apparently in the hotel, seemed undisturbed. But I saw plays all week. If I couldn't get into a play, I'd go to movies, so I'd see maybe 2, 3 plays or movies a day for a week or so. And then a buddy of mine went with me to Scotland to visit something like a second cousin by marriage. But that was an instance in which we in military uniform were treated as if we were something very special. This man we visited was a businessman. I remember he called his banker. I didn't know what he was doing, but he started to explain to his banker that instead of his going to the bank to transact their business, that he had this distinguished visitor. I was looking around to see who this could be. So this president of the bank comes over to Eric's business, you see, and they transact their business. Then they take me to lunch and ask me questions such as, did I think the United States was going to continue its isolationist policy? I didn't know. His brother, by the way, was an ear, nose, and throat specialist who had received the Fellow of Royal College of Surgery distinction, an honorary, very honorary. Mm-hmm. So I got to talk with him, and I'd had some speech correction background, so some of that was rather interesting.
Sure.
Also on shorter leaves, I visited Cambridge, where a family invited us out, and with only a couple of chickens, they fed us eggs and touching things like this, very, very much sharing. And we got to learn a little bit about the educational system in Cambridge, mm-hmm. talking with the headmaster there. Then eventually we were shipped back home, and the adjustment for me was largely one of feeling that they had everything backwards, because we were supposed to be readjusted. And I expect I was not alone. And my attitude was we were the ones who had been overseas, and we had some experience in a different climate, culture, and perhaps the adjusting needed to be done as much by others, if not more. But we outgrow those things after a while.
Yeah. What was your first new experience now back from the war? You'd been in educational matters. You went off to service. What happened?
I went back to Indiana State.
Oh, did you?
And served another short term in as a hearing consultant. And they gave me a teaching assignment. Unlike what we do in the department here now, they gave me a book and told me when the class met. So I taught, it was the equivalent of our public speaking fundamentals.
Oh, the beginning fundamentals class.
That's right. And I had veterans in my class. It spoiled me for the rest of my life because they were motivated. And you just drop a hint, an assignment, and they were off and doing it. Other students scrambling to keep up. And it was a great experience.
Sounds like a positive experience, too.
Very positive. And one of the positive aspects was the textbook we were using that time was by Lou Surratt.
Oh, yeah.
And Principles and Types of Speech. And that book was adopted by some 90-some% of the institutions around the country. And it was because of Surratt being at Northwestern, and because Irving Lee was there in general semantics, and I was interested in that by that time, that I applied to Northwestern, and with the support of some of the local people, the faculty that were connected with Northwestern, I was accepted and became Irving Lee's graduate assistant at Northwestern.
You're an assistant again, like you were before the war, but a little different situation now.
That's right. This was one where, for example, the main thing I did as his assistant was to help him with a class that was about 300 and up to 350 students, called Language and Thought. It was taught in a big chem lab set up with a big, long black table up front. And Irving Lee could lecture to a group that size as if he were talking to 10 people. It was just fabulous. And we assisted by attending and then grading exams and talking with students and sometimes making up questions or exercises for consideration. And otherwise, filling in when needed somewhere. Dr. Lee was ill occasionally. He died, by the way, of cancer at 45, which was just a few years after I left Northwestern. No, about 55, I should say, when he was 45 years old. And he was a lecturer at the Air War College, so when he was gone, the other assistant who preceded me, but an old buddy of mine, Harry Weinberg, who subsequently wrote The Levels of Knowing and Existence, a very good book. Harry and I would fill in. Harry, when Lee was gone, Harry would take the class and perform some kind of exercise. And one of these involved what we call identification, treating the words as if they were the thing or the map as if it were the territory and all that sort of thing. So after the students had been exposed to that, Dr. Lee would be gone, Harry would go in and he'd give a little lecture about concentrated foods. You know, we were in the war period or aftermath and all the great advantages of research and concentrated foods and so on. And then he'd say, I have a sample for you. I'd like you to try it, and then I'll ask you how you like it. So we handed out these little cracker-type things, and students would taste them, and then he'd say, how many of you would like to have these around the house for a snack, or not that, don't like that. Well, you like to have them for camping trips or whatever, or you wouldn't like to have them around at all. You don't like them. So he'd take a count, see, on each of these categories, write up on the board. Then he would say, let me read you about this, and he'd pull this box out from under this big, long, black bench I mentioned. And he'd start reading about the balanced nutrition and the purity of the ingredients, and I don't know what all. It sounded like a godsend for nutrition. The only thing was, this was a dog biscuit box. So then, after they found out they'd eaten dog biscuits, he'd take another count, see. And all the ones that the best liked, that category went way down.
Way down.
And the one they wanted to hear went way up. And then he'd give a little lecture. Well, what's this about you never identify, you never make this mistake? These words made this difference. Look at that. So he would do that each time Lee would go. He did it 3 or 4 times.
Great object lesson.
You know, one day Harry and I walked across campus, and he said, hey, Carter, what am I going to do when Lee's going out of town again? I said, we're going to do a dog biscuit routine. So I can't do it anymore. Why not? He said, well, the kids are beginning to bark before dog biscuits. So I said, well, Harry, I don't know. I do. I know what I'm going to do. What's that? I'm going to give them some grasshopper pancakes. He said, I found a recipe for grasshopper pancakes this other day. You can't do that. Why not? Well, Harry, there are health laws and things. Oh, you worry too much. So the time came, or close to it, and the knock on our apartment door. Harry was batching it those days, and here was Harry and my wife, Mim, answered the door. He didn't say hello. He said, Mim, will you cook my pancakes for me? She said, well, sure, Harry, come on in. So we cooked these grasshopper pancakes, sampled them. They're pretty good. And he went through that same routine with these grasshopper pancakes. I swear he did. And when he was finished, when the students were leaving, some of them were trailing along. Harry was out ahead of us. One of them said to me, he wouldn't do that, would he? I said, you don't know Harry Weinberg. Yes, he not only did it, my wife cooked them. So those were the lighter moments at Northwestern.
Sounds like a memorable time.
Yes. We had, our first child was born.
I was wondering, I was going to ask you, your wife, where did you two hitch up, let's say? Where did you get acquainted and that sort of thing?
Well, we first met at the University of Maine.
Oh,
and
way back there.
She was hither and yon, among other places. She took the nursing aides course, whatever it was called, but they needed more nursing than they had nurses. And she went through the Navy concentrated program and served in the Naval Hospital in San Diego area. So that's where she picked up viral pneumonia and nearly died of it, actually. Yeah. And then it was after that that we were married in Terre Haute, actually.
Back in Indiana. Before you
and
went
then Sandra was born in 1950. And I finished my doctorate in 1950. I went to Penn State in 1950.
Hey, 50 was a big year.
Yeah, it was. Where I was, that was my first job when Bob Oliver was head of the department there.
Under name and communication.
And they had a doctoral program, and I served for a while as well, the same function Hugh Cowden's been doing recently before that doctoral program, the initial advising for all the doctoral students, and taught Introduction to Graduate Study, for which I had no formal preparation to mention. So I had to learn that from pretty much from the ground up, and a few seminars, and eventually taught some general semantics.
Pretty well decided now you want to teach and do research?
Oh, yes, yes. I found out I wanted to teach when I had that assistantship at Indiana State.
Even before grasshopper pancakes?
Yes. Grasshopper pancakes confirmed my interest.
Yeah.
Anybody could do that and get away with it. It's very fascinating. I was with them at Penn State for, it was 11 years, I think it was. A total of 13, but it was something like 10 or 11 years afterwards. A local information systems company that was beginning to do a deal of business with the Department of Defense. Inquired about someone with background to help them with a certain project. And so Bob Oliver referred me to them, and I went for interviews, and although I had held security clearances, they couldn't really tell me anything. So this was an interview by analogy. And so I eventually ended up working with that company on projects for the Department of Defense, military intelligence type projects, which had a big influence on my later teaching because of the sciences involved and the scholarly problems and so on. And then I came here, 1966.
Now, what on earth, no mention has been made thus far in your dialogue here about life of UNO. You'd never heard of us, I imagine. How did you get to know and come to us?
Well, when I left HRB Singer, I wanted to go back into academic work, so I sent my resume around, including Jack Brillhart.
Another Penn Stater.
Yes, and I had directed his master's thesis and his doctoral dissertation. So he knew me, and they were looking for someone to replace George Ratchford, who was acting then as graduate dean, but also as vice president, you called him then, what we now call chancellor. So he was too busy. So that vacancy was filled by yours truly through Jack Brillhart.
And the year would have been?
1966.
All right, you came to the university then just a few years before the merger, actually.
I came when Trawick was president. When the deans of the colleges included John Lucas in business, Frank Gorman in education. This is before Paul Kennedy, if you can believe that. And Paul was chairman of secondary ed, I think it was at that time.
Yes, I believe so.
Because I remember I was interviewed by Holly Bethel in Paul's place. Holly was head of elementary education. And of course, Bob Harper in arts and sciences, Anston Marston in engineering, and of course in the graduate office was Ratchford's associate, I don't know if his title was associate, or Bob O'Reilly, who is now in education administration. And the graduate office was being pretty much operated by one lady named Martha Helligsoe. You may remember.
Yes, I remember Martha well.
Martha with us for years. And chairman of the board, this was Omaha U then. I think that was Bob Spire in that period of time.
Yes.
Who is now our Attorney General. Always had positive things to say about everything, including graduate areas and so on. And the merger was 2 years later, 1968.
Well, when you came to the graduate college, Elton, it was really kind of a small affair, wasn't it?
Approximately 800 students.
But the programs were limited to?
Well, I don't remember the number of programs exactly,
just
but
the general area.
It was somewhere around a dozen to 15, something like this. Now I think we have over 20. So the number of programs has grown. The number of students has more than doubled.
Has it?
And the major difference that I noticed with the merger was the improvement in the competition for faculty. I mean, we hired during that time people who were second to none in the country in teaching and scholarship and research, publication, and the whole works.
I was going to ask you, you'd spent so much time in places like Northwestern and Penn State, very big universities. What was your first impression of this place?
Oh, I suppose the first impression was one of very conscientious people, students, many of whom work for a living.
Yes.
And a faculty with a passionate interest in teaching. If we have a tradition, I would guess that would be it. Longest, deeply rooted tradition. And of course, with the merger, going into it, a threat to our existence. It's no exaggeration, I think, to say that Kirk Naylor, of course, with Cooperation for People, saved this university. And then with the merger, the struggle for autonomy, with some tempting offers of sorts. For example, when I was a member of the committee for the graduate aspect of the merger, the graduate dean at Lincoln at that time was James Olson, the one who wrote the history of Nebraska. And in our first meeting, of which he was chairman, he described Lincoln as one of the members of the American universities, distinguished and all that, one of the longest history, and so on this way for a little while. And then, as I understood him, he was offering to accept the graduate faculty at UNO as associate members of the graduate faculty university system. And we'll never know what the advantages might have been, but we were all of one mind not to go that way. So my response was that it reminded me that I had a brother who was much younger than I was, but the quality was just as good. It didn't go over too well. Well, but out of that struggle came the Executive Graduate Council with the Dean of the Graduate College of the System and the campus deans, and a committee structure with 3 committees that are parallel to the 3 we have now. And then the campus deans served to chair these systems committees, so that if you're talking curriculum, for example, a proposal for a new course at the Med College came through that committee, and we were responsible for making recommendations to the council as a whole. That whole structure was created, and then eventually, a few years later, it was reviewed to see if it should continue. And I was appointed to serve on that committee, and it was reviewed critically. And I guess everybody knows, Graduate Area knows we kept it. And its great virtue, I suppose, it is the one faculty that is genuinely a faculty of the system.
Yes.
All the graduate degrees are degrees of the University of Nebraska. And then in the earlier days of that council, we had a review, something like the reviews we have every 5 years now, of each graduate department at UNO, and we set up the committees so that there was a representative of the Lincoln or Med Center campus, possibly both, on each of these committees. And they went through the self-study, the whole works, something like an accreditation procedure, so that every one of our graduate programs on this campus was examined critically.
Exhaustively examined.
Yes. And the reports and so on. We were struggling constantly for budget. Following the merger, certain things happened that wouldn't have happened otherwise. You remember, perhaps, Paul, Harold Kiefover, who was in the business. Harold came back from one of the meetings concerning merger, and at the Executive Council meeting, he looked at me and said, they have at Lincoln a research fund. They have it there, we should have it here. So I said, thank you, Harold, and pursued it. And we were able, at the time that Vic Blackwell was president of what was the University Senate, now Faculty Senate, and we set up the research committee, and we had an ad hoc committee to set it up, and we sat around and talked about how much money could we use and use wisely. And I remember we started with what would now be a drop in the bucket. It still isn't enough. It was $36,000. And that was the most appreciated for the amount of money and so on of anything that I know of in that whole period. I remember Bob Harper said his faculty was just delighted that we had some research money.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to be primarily seed money, but a number of faculty were able to establish research programs that otherwise probably wouldn't have been able to do so.
Like starting a garden, you got something started there.
Yes, it was terrific.
Yeah.
Then we were able to get such things as graduate student tuition remission by similar maneuvering and so on. And I suppose the most important aspect of that whole development was that we were perceived by faculty candidates, and I suppose some graduate students, as being in a different league than the municipal university could expect to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that all parts of the system should be credited with that.
Yeah.
I remember we got some appropriate acknowledgement and support when I used to maintain that we wanted graduate faculty members and graduate faculty fellows, the doctoral level faculty, at UNO to measure up to exactly the same standards as anywhere else in the system. And we never had any difficulty with those comparability standards. We had difficulty establishing how we're going to do it. But
as you describe it, that aspect of our merger with the system and the graduate involvement there between campuses seemed to work out generally through the way you've described it very, very well for all
yes,
concerned.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I really do.
But now, after not too many years, or a number of years, somewhere along the line, Elton Carter decided, say, I don't want to do this administrating anymore.
That was 9 years after I started.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And you came back over to our department.
That is right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of those early meetings had to do with faculty slots and recruitment. And since I had not been intimately involved with some of those positions, I thought we should do whatever was possible to go for high-quality faculty. And the short version of that story is that's when we recruited, among others, Bob Carlson.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those slots in that time period were filled in my early days back in the department. And then another merger had taken place with journalism,
yes,
broadcasting, and speech, and by this time drama had been included in the new arts college.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there had been also a new public affairs and community services college and a Goodrich program.
Yeah.
All of that
Yeah.
growth. And I might mention that when we were with the University Senate, I was appointed for 5 different years as an administrative representative when it was University Senate before Faculty Senate. And then I was elected, believe it or not, by faculty members in the Policy and Planning Committee to chair that committee. And we did an extensive long-range planning that heavily involved the faculty. I did the ghostwriting for a letter from Kirk Naylor which said, in effect, faculty, you want a word and a voice in planning what this institution should be like and so on. If so, this is the opportunity. And we had a magnificent response. We expected the faculty were going to ask for the moon, and they didn't. They asked reasonable. They had reasonable requests for growth, and I thought that worked out rather well. It was not the first time we'd ever done any planning. There had been a committee of 20 way back there before.
Yeah.
It seems like a long way now.
Yeah.
But out of that long-range planning, among other things, I think, came the Regents Commission. Now, it's not as simple as cause and effect, but Gene Butig was then Cliff Hardin's was then what we now call Chancellor.
He was his assistant, as I recall.
And Budig was his assistant.
Yeah.
And Budig visited our committee. Now, I don't know what he said when he got back talking with Hardin, but if it's not cause-effect, it's least chronological, because after that came the Regents Commission on the Urban University of the 70s. Now, the Regents Commission was useful for soliciting funds for the budget,
yeah,
temporarily, somewhat, for a couple of years. The legislature funds what it wants to fund. But that commission was, the members were appointed by the members of the board, who of course are elected in Nebraska.
Yeah.
So it was politically grounded.
Mm-hmm.
It had some influence on funding. Now, in the departmental scene that we were talking about, this made some difference insofar as the activities of the department were related to the long-range interests of the university. But it was not sufficient to support adequately any such structure as a school of communication,
No.
which we need now.
No.
Needed then, but it wasn't nearly as big then as it is now.
Yeah. How big was it then? Do you recall roughly? Because we've grown so much in these last years.
Well, the graduate program has grown from a few dozen to about 130, I guess
Yeah,
it is.
just in
something like this.
communication.
Yes.
It's tremendous, yeah. Yeah.
Now, the graduate program in business had grown, perhaps not simply as a result, but following raising standards, and Dave Ambrose administered that program, and it was a rigorous admissions and retention and so on.
Mm-hmm.
We did something similar in our department, and I think the quality of our program, which as I understand it from National Comparative Evaluation Studies, is in the top 10, viewed in some quarters in the top 2 in the country for a master's program.
We can be happy about that, can't
Yeah.
we?
So the number of students seemed to grow with the reputation of the program.
Elton, in the time we've got remaining, I wanted to ask you about some things. In the years you've been here, 20-some years now, you've rubbed shoulders with thousands of people. And maybe this is an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
All right.
In the making of our university, its growth and change and whatever other aspect, mention briefly, if you would, some people whom you think historically deserve a place of honorable mention.
Well, in no particular sequence.
Yeah.
You can hardly look at UNO now without noticing the Afghan program, International Studies. That started with a faculty member who had been in Afghanistan, lived there. If I remember correct, his name was Criss Library. And he and Dick Lane visited my office when I was graduate deaning to ask about support of the program for the graduate aspect. And they had strategies that worked for getting it started. They went and told people what they would be able to offer instead of a typical sales approach.
Mm-hmm.
I think both of these gentlemen would belong in that history.
I agree.
I would put Frank Forbes in that history for what he's been honored for and everybody knows about, his outstanding teaching and so on. But Frank was ombudsman.
Mm-hmm.
And the beginning of that was with a committee. I served on it with Wayne Wheeler as chairman to set up the ombudsman's office, which we no longer have as such. But one quick example, I had a student come in my office one time and sat down and said, "I have seen my lawyer and you can't do this to me." I said, "What?" "Well, it was an admissions problem." And being threatened with a lawyer, I couldn't think of anything better to do than to counter with another lawyer, namely Frank Forbes. And I said, "Would you agree to whatever Frank Forbes decides would be appropriate?" "Yes." So I breathed again. And that's an example of one among many of Frank having contributed. I would think that Floyd Waterman who rescued me one time from being accused of prejudice. I think he would belong in that category for his work in heading up our unit on the north side of Omaha for a number of years.
Yeah.
And of course, subsequently, he's traveled. You've had him on this program, I think.
I'm going to have him on this one. I've talked to him a number of times. He's done tremendous work.
I guess we'd have to include Ron Roskins, not because he likes rhubarb and I used to furnish it for him, but because he, I think he administered this university from the insult of West Dodge High, the degrading, into the era in which we began to be recognized, and that was marked about 1973 or 4, somewhere along there, when the Chamber of Commerce invited administrators and others from the faculty to a dinner. The governor had a few kind words and so on. It's the first time I know of that there was such an open public recognition of UNO, followed by favorable editorials in the World Herald and so on. So I think there was a turning point, and I think Roskins deserves leadership credit for that. Kirk Naylor, I mentioned before.
Yeah.
I had a call from a landlady one time complaining about the morals and behavior of a tenant who was a graduate assistant of ours. And I thought, well, this could be trouble, so I better report it in case it is trouble. So I went to President Naylor's office, told him about it, and he said, do you believe in innocent until proven guilty? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, thank you, and I left. Subsequently, we got a call explaining that the landlady was sore at this guy and it was all a false accusation. But for his great integrity, of course, Kirk's father was a minister, I think.
Yes, he was.
And he lived his religion as best anybody I know. The difficulty with a question like this is who you leave out.
I know.
I would not want to leave out Paul Kennedy, a great friend and candid gentleman.
Yes, you can say that of Paul.
Always respected his position. Ralph Wardle, Dave Scott, who of course headed sociology and then ushered in the public affairs area we have now.
Right.
In the department, I'm getting in more dangerous ground now. I leave out somebody. I'm very proud that we were able to employ, for example, Bruce Johansson. Because he stutters, other places turned him down, and I think that's an example of hiring people because they have capabilities, not handicaps.
Yes.
A tremendous writer and scholar. Hugh Cowden has contributed not only to the department, and is going to do it again by accepting the chairmanship a second time, but university-wide leadership through the faculty senate and the union and so on. Bob Riley, for his not only prolific but high-quality scholarly work and writing, and a gentleman. We're reminded at such things as the awards luncheon of the comparative status and capability of scholars such as Warren Franke, who in journalism, history, and criticism and so on, I think is unsurpassed. I don't know where to quit.
Well, you've covered a lot of territory there, and I thank you for that. A lot of people have trouble remembering some names. You pulled a lot of them out of your note and head there. I appreciate that. We've got a few minutes left, Elton, and I did want to ask you a few other things, too. You spent such a long time as a scholar, and I consider you that, and a teacher. As you look back on all these years of labor among students and staff and faculty, what aspect of university life or any aspect of education have you liked the most, and why?
Working with the students at all levels, by the way. I was pleased that I was able, because of my background, to write the syllabus, essentially what we're using now in in this multiple section course in public speaking foundations, fundamentals. I've directed 5 theses and another one in the wings that all have in common a methodology which may have some distinctiveness about it, because it views communication as process and says where we cannot foresee far enough ahead, we have to know what we're going to do at each juncture, as we might say. That involves a whole new what we call communication methodology. And another one where we had an interview type study, but it used a new development called the long interview, which was a library study Mary Griffin did on the reference interview in libraries. The developments in the 2 seminars that I taught, and one of them the foundation seminar called Transactional Communication, which was paired off with Hugh Cowden's in mass communication. And I covered the miscellaneous side of that. And then communication theory, and the nature of those courses were such, we had an opportunity, I think, to influence the students, which is the greatest reward of all.
Yes. On that note, I want to ask you another question. You're going to make a list now, a brief list of the qualities that you feel make a fine teacher. Pick it up anywhere you like and talk about it briefly. We have not too much time left, but I wanted you to talk a little about that.
Well, out of the 7 to 15 theoretical approaches to communication, if you pick one, I can answer your question. They all would contribute something, but there's one in particular called dialogical communication that derives out of what Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian, religious anthropologist, called the I-thou relationship, which is known in other circles as well. I think that respect for a student on the part of a teacher is perhaps number one. The confidence that they can do what they don't believe at the time they can possibly manage, and then help them by confrontations, if you will, with differences, and then help in ways that they might not find particularly pleasant sometimes, maybe frustrating, but eventually they grow. So I think it's the quality of the interpersonal relationship and the ability to learn, and more important, to learn how to learn so you can keep on learning, and to enable students to learn how to learn. It sounds like a cliche, but unless they become their own teachers, so to speak, then the half-life of their knowledge is going to be very short.
The love of learning.
Yes, the love of learning.
Hey, Elton, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to sit for an hour or so and visit with you about your life, other places, and here on the campus too. 10 seconds. What are you going to do in retirement, Elton?
I'm going to work with a group that I've named Escapades. I've mentioned it to people and they're envious. So I'll make you envious. The name is derived from E.S. Carter alumni, Partnership and Dialogue Explorations.
That sounds great.
These are students who had both seminars with me, and I'm inviting a few of them, and we're going to read books and talk about them, and we're going to dialogue and have fun.
That sounds wonderful, and it sounds as though you continue your scholarly activity on into retirement too, as you, I think, very appropriately should do. My thanks to you for joining me.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. It's a privilege.
This has been another hour in our series we refer to as Reflections in Time with Dr. Elton Carter. We thank him for joining us, and we hope you can enjoy this along with the many other hours we've done now of this series here at our University of Nebraska at Omaha.